Walking with Jesus through the Gospels. We're in Matthew chapter 23, and we are on Tuesday of the Passion Week, as it's referred to oftentimes. The Passion comes from the King James of Acts chapter 1, where it speaks about his last week before the cross. We looked at the latter part of, pretty well all of Matthew 23 last time we were together, but I want to use these last few verses as an overlap before we get into the extensive teaching Jesus is going to give in Matthew chapters 24 and 25, and as they relate to Mark's gospel and in Luke's. So we'll look at those parallels in just a few moments, but we're going to pick it up here in verse 35. So Matthew 23 and verse 35. He had been rebuking them already, the fact that he had sent prophets to them, and they had persecuted them from town to town, and so that on you, verse 35, may come all the righteous bloodshed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar. Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. Jesus is drawing their attention to the prophets of the Hebrew Scriptures, basically throughout their history. So from the very beginning, looking at Abel, righteous Abel, in Genesis chapter 4, all the way up to Zechariah in 2 Chronicles chapter 24. To appreciate this, we need to understand that the layout of the books of the Hebrew Scriptures is different than our English layout, the sequence of the books, where ours ends in Malachi, theirs ends with 2 Chronicles. So bringing it from righteous Abel to Zechariah, the king had him killed, but Jesus is, in a sense, drawing their guilt with their ancestors because of their willingness to destroy the mouthpiece, the prophets of God in their day, where they had desired to get rid of John the Baptizer. And it wasn't at their hands that he was put to death. It was Herod. But had the opportunity, they would have done it themselves, even as they were scheming and planning the death of Jesus. So Jesus is making them, or calling them guilty, not making them, they've made it themselves, but drawing the parallel here that they are just as guilty as their forefathers were, although they would say that if we lived at that time, we wouldn't have had anything to do with it. Then he says to them, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it." And he's not talking about the geographical city, Jerusalem, Jerusalem. He's talking about the inhabitants, and more specifically, the religious leaders, as he's been addressing the scribes and the Pharisees. But as you will recall, he's not speaking to the scribes and Pharisees directly. He's speaking to the crowds of people to be on their guard against the hypocrisy and the falsehoods of the scribes and the Pharisees. So he says that his desire is that how often would I have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing. When he says, I wanted to gather your children, he's not speaking about their little ones, but he's speaking about the population of Jerusalem, of the entirety of Israel, really, because Jerusalem was the seat of the religious leaders' authority. And this is where they carried out they called it their headquarters. And even as Jesus spoke about the temple just a couple of days earlier, this is Tuesday, so on Sunday, he had come in and rebuked them when he's overturning the tables of the money changers, driving them out, the buyers and the sellers. And he said that My house is to be a house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it a den of robbers, a den of thieves. So a hideout, a headquarters for those that would be rebellious against God. He says he wanted to draw them or bring them under his wings. The parallel here is in Ruth chapter 2. Boaz is speaking to Ruth after he meets her, and this is what he speaks to her about. He says in verse 12, "The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." So Ruth had determined that she was going to give her life, her faith, her everything to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so it was under his wings that she had come for provision and protection to enjoy the presence of the living God. And in chapter 3, we will discover that she comes to the threshing floor at Naomi's advice and her instruction, and she comes to Boaz, who is laid down at midnight, the middle of the night, and uncovers his feet. He wakes up at this and he wonders and asks, "Who's there?" But as he's startled by this movement, and she asks that he would cover her with his garment, his wing, so that you would spread your garment, your wings over me. It's the same word that's used in chapter 3 as it was in chapter 2, coming under the Lord's wings to take refuge. And here we have a picture of Jesus in Boaz and the church in Ruth. And this is what Jesus' desire has been, is that he would take the children of Israel, the people of Israel, under his wings for provision and protection so that they could enjoy his presence. But they would not have anything to do with it. They weren't willing. And so for the time being, that's set aside, and he's bringing it now to what will become his church, the bride of Christ. He says in verse 38, "See, your house is left to you desolate." Desolate means destroyed, devastated. Both the prophets Jeremiah and Isaiah spoke about this, the foretelling of the destruction of Jerusalem. In Isaiah, it's chapter 64 and verse 11. In Jeremiah, it's chapter 12, verse 7, and 22 and verse 5, where there's elements there being spoken of the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, in the immediate context, it's in reference to Babylon for Jeremiah's, and Jesus is taking a hold of that, and he's saying that that's going to be in place now. It's being repeated. Nothing new under the sun, as the writer of Ecclesiastes would say. He says, you will not see me again until you say, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord," so that their hearts would come into alignment, the hearts of the religious leaders, the rulers of Israel, that they would come into alignment with what the general population, many of them who have become followers of Jesus, had expressed 2 days earlier when he came into Jerusalem riding on the donkey. And they quoted Psalm 118 and verse 26 when they said, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." But Jesus says, "You won't see me again until you declare this." And now that's not going to happen until the end of the tribulation, which is not that far away. So 7 years at the very least, and should Jesus come back today, then that tribulation is going to begin at any moment thereafter. I want us to go to Luke's Gospel, Luke chapter 21, and this is where we will find a parallel with Matthew chapter 24, and also in Mark chapter 12, the last few verses there in verses 41 to 44. So I bring our attention to Luke chapter 21 because this is going to lead into the very next thing that Jesus is going to address for the general crowds that are around in Luke's gospel, for his disciples who will be on the Mount of Olives later that evening, later tonight, as he will answer their questions about the sign of his coming and the end of it and the end of the age. So in Luke chapter 21, Mark says the same thing in chapter 12, as I already indicated. Jesus looked up and saw the rich putting their gifts into the offering box. And he saw a poor widow put in 2 small copper coins. And he said, "Truly, I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all of them, for they all contributed out of their abundance. But she, out of her poverty, put in all she had to live on." Now, do you remember when we had looked at the pretense of the scribes and the Pharisees? Jesus saying that you hypocrites, that you make, for a pretense, you make long prayers. And then we looked at Mark and Luke's account drawing that in, where it says that they love to walk around in their long robes and to get the greetings in the marketplace and the best seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at the feasts. So this is just the last few verses of Luke chapter 20. Who devour widows' houses and for a pretense make long prayers. They will receive greater condemnation. Well, after Jesus completes all of this, because remember, Mark and Luke's focus here, just these few verses, is the summarizing of what Matthew had recorded for us in chapter 23 with all of the woes to the hypocrites, to these blind guides, these blind fools. And then Mark and Luke insert this before the Olivet Discourse, as it's usually referred to as, the teaching that Jesus gave regarding the second coming and when his kingdom will be established. So Jesus, he is seated in the court of the Gentiles, and he's looking at the offering boxes. 13 of them there were. They had like trumpets, where they were cone-shaped receptacles that went into the wall, and then on the other side of the wall there were boxes that received the contributions. So these looked like trumpets sticking out of the wall. And Jesus is watching those that would be coming. And he notices, he takes notice. So he's doing this purposefully. And he draws their attention to this widow. And not only a widow, but poor widow. Because there were some widows that could have been wealthy based upon whatever provision or station in life that her family had or her husband had before his passing. But Jesus intentionally draws their attention to this woman by calling her a poor widow. And it's not by coincidence that it is on the very heels of Jesus having spoken about these hypocritical leaders were devouring widows' houses. And perhaps these same religious leaders were then bringing contributions at the temple, but they're giving, as Jesus said, he saw many rich putting their gifts into the offering box. So this poor widow, she puts in 2 small copper coins. The coin that she is using here is the lepta. Now a lepta is 1/128. This is a fraction, all right? 1/128 of a denarius. And a denarius was a day's wage. She puts in 2 of these. So that means it's 1/64 of a day's wage. If you do the math, it works out to about 12 minutes of a day being worked for a salary. So you can imagine if you punched into your place of employment for 12 minutes, and that's what you're going to get paid for today. Now, if you're a very wealthy person and your business a place of employment pays extremely well, then 12 minutes may be very sizable. But for the average income, 12 minutes isn't going to do very much. Just to give you an understanding, so you have a full day, denarius. Half of that would be working half of the day, and then working a quarter of that would be half of the morning, and then working an eighth of that would be even less, and then a 64th of that, which would be half of that yet again. So we're working it right down to about 12 minutes of the day being worked. And in practical terms, that means that this would be enough money for her to buy enough flour for one sparse meal, not a full meal, but a sparse meal, just enough flour to make a cake of bread. So we're not talking of a loaf like you and I would go to the store and get a loaf. We're talking about just taking some water and flour, pressing it into a cake, maybe the size of your hand, possibly two of those, and cooking it over some fire. And that is the meal. So that's what we're talking about here. So this is what Jesus draws their attention to. This woman, she gave, what does she give? She had everything, she puts in everything she had to live on. So that means she doesn't even have enough bread, enough money to buy a sparse amount of bread for a meal. This is indicating for us that this woman, she is trusting in the Lord for her provisions. She has complete trust in God. And you can't help but seeing here a similarity with Ruth once again. Ruth, who was a widow, she had nothing to live on. And that being the case, she comes and throws herself at the mercy of Boaz, the Messiah figure that is in that encounter. And Ruth receives what she's looking for. And we can be certain that this woman who Jesus notices, and he is pointing her out to his disciples, that she is not gone unnoticed by him nor his father, indicating that she will indeed, in spite of the abuses and the devouring of these religious leaders, that God will take care of her. An amazing and beautiful picture that Jesus is giving to us here. There's more being said to us in this picture than is actually being spoken. So when Jesus spoke in Matthew chapter 6 to his disciples and to those that were gathered together at the Sermon on the Mount, as it's referred, that he said, don't worry about what you'll eat or what you will wear, because your Father knows what you have need of. He sees the birds of the air and the lilies of the field. Neither one of them toil or spin. They don't work at trying to make sure they have enough. Their Father knows what they have need of. And he says that you are worth more than many sparrows. Jesus is showing us his love and his compassion for his people. So the ones that he would long to bring unto himself and under his wings, to protect and cover them, this is one of those that is the picture of the one that would come and receive the covering of the Lord. Well, that brings us then to verse 5. While some were speaking of the temple, how it was adorned with noble stones and offerings, he said, as for these things, I just want to point out, in case there's any confusion, we're still in Luke chapter 21, and now in verse 6. As for these things that you see, the days will come when there will not be left here one stone upon another. You remember we had just read in Matthew 23 that your city is going to be left desolate to you. So they're all going to be thrown down, these stones. They asked him, Teacher, when will these things be, and what will be the sign when these things are about to take place? And he said, See that you're not led astray, for many will come in my name, saying, I am he, and the time is at hand. Do not go after them. And when you hear of wars and tumults, do not be terrified, for these things must first take place, but the end will not be at once. He speaks to them and says, Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be great earthquakes, and in various places, famines and pestilences. and there will be terrors and great signs from heaven. But before all this, they will lay their hands on you and persecute you, delivering you up to the synagogues and prisons, and you will be brought before kings and governors for my name's sake. Let's go over to Matthew chapter 24. Mark 13 is the parallel with this, but we're not going to really be consulting with Mark because Mark says everything that Matthew does, but Matthew speaks and includes more details in this discourse. Let's see some of the parallels that are taking place. Did you notice where was Jesus when he gave the teaching in Luke chapter 21? It was when he was still in the temple and the people were speaking about the temple. Some were speaking about the temple. And so he takes that opportunity to address that observance. So in chapter 24 of Matthew, Jesus left the temple and was going away when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. But he answered them, "You see all these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." And as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" What Jesus will give to them on the Mount of Olives is more detail than what he gives to those that are gathered in the temple earlier, just a short time earlier in Luke chapter 21. He says, "See that no one leads you astray, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and they will lead many astray. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you're not alarmed, for this must take place. But the end is not yet, for nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are but the beginning of the birth pains. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another. And many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. And because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. The one who endures to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come." It seems like what Jesus is saying here is identical in both instances. But there is some important details that we need to pay attention to. Jesus will continue on in Matthew's account and speak about, "So when you see," verse 15, "the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down to take what is in his house. And let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas, for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that your flight may not be in winter or on a Sabbath, for then there will be great tribulation, such as not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be." And then it continues on. So we'll look at the continuing details in a moment. Keep a marker there, and let's go back to Luke chapter 21. So you notice that there were some details already that are very similar about nation rising against nation, and earthquakes and famines and pestilences and so on. And then he says, so Luke 21, regarding in verse 12, that before all this they will lay their hands on you and persecute you, delivering you up to the synagogues and prisons, and you will be brought before kings and governors for my name's sake. This will be your opportunity to bear witness. Settle it therefore in your minds not to meditate beforehand how to answer. For I will give you a mouth and wisdom, which none of your adversaries will be able to withstand or contradict. You will be delivered up even by parents and brothers and relatives and friends, And some of you they will put to death. You will be hated by all for my name's sake. Not a hair of your head shall perish. By your endurance you will gain your lives. Now, this is where it appears, coming up, what's coming next, that these two accounts are still the same, similar, but it's the same thing. But there's a very distinct difference going on here. So verse 20, but when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation has come near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let those who are inside the city depart, and let not those who are out in the country enter in it. For these are days of vengeance to fulfill all that is written. Alas, for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days. Now you hear that detail sounds almost identical to what Jesus says in Matthew 24 and verse 19. For there will be great distress upon the earth and wrath against this people. So in verse 23, he says there will be great distress upon the earth and wrath against the people. Where it says in Matthew's account, then there will be great tribulation. Make a mental note of those two things, great distress and great tribulation. These are not referring to the same period of time. It's a distinction between two occurrences. Because there are many today who will look at these three accounts, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Matthew 24, Luke 21, and Mark's account parallel to Matthew's in chapter 13. And they will say, in light of Luke's account, where Jerusalem will be surrounded and it will be destroyed, we know that that happened in 70 AD. So they will say that in light of that, all of these occurrences were fulfilled in, before, or by 70 AD. So none of these are yet future occurrences. Yet they are, because they fail to recognize there's two aspects that Jesus is referring to here. Let me draw your attention to the screen for a moment, and we're going to have a look at some details. Now, Jesus had said that the time is coming when not one stone will be left upon the other, and this is what Jerusalem at the western side of the Temple Mount looks like today. So this is the rubble that still sits after the city was destroyed. So not one stone left remaining. These are some of the portions of the retaining wall. But if you were to go on the Temple Mount, you would see that there are none of the buildings that stood there. The structures of the temple or the Solomon's colonnade, the storehouse that is there, none of these things are still standing or remain. And in 70 AD, every one of those buildings on the Temple Mount were deconstructed. They were demolished. We'll look at that in just a moment, the details of that. All right, when you look at this, there's something called resolving power. If you were to take up astronomy and look into the night sky, there may be two heavenly bodies, stars, asteroids, whatever they might be, and they're side by side, in close proximity. Now, I don't mean directly beside each other, but in close proximity, so that to the naked eye or to a weak telescope, it would look like it's only one body, one star, one asteroid, when in reality, there are two. And this is what that might look like. So if you took the two of them and there's an overlapping aspect of it. So if you get a stronger telescope, you would see that it's not one, but there are two close together, which gives the appearance as though it's just one. So here we see the two circles overlapping, one being listed or detailed as Matthew 24, and the other one is Luke 21. So we see in the beginning of sorrows is what is held in common by both of these. The beginning of sorrows, the famines, the pestilences, nation rising against nation, these are the common areas. the beginning of sorrows. But there is difference. In Luke 21, let's look at verse 12. Look what it says. Very important wording here. But before all this, or before these things. So that's chapter 21 of Luke and verse 12. Then look at Matthew 24 and verse 9. You will see that in verse 9 it says, then they will deliver you up. So there's a sequence of events where Luke, Jesus is saying, and before these things, but before this, and then he says some details. In Matthew's account, when he says about these beginning of sorrows, he says then, so there will be some things taking place after those things. So we see that there is a desolation of Jerusalem in Luke's account. Then know that its desolation has come near. That's in verse 20. Then there is a desolation of Jerusalem in Matthew's account. That's in verse 15. So when you see the abomination of desolation, these are two separate desolations. So stick with me here and we will see the differences. There are details that are given, these beginning of sorrows, where there's in Matthew and Luke's account. Mark, we're just already assuming that that's being carbon copied in Matthew's account. But we see it also in Revelation chapter 6. There's false Christs, there's wars, famines, pestilences, and earthquakes. So we see them as a package, as it were, and then there's going to be cosmic upheaval in the heavens. That's something coming later. And we see that detailed on the screen and continued in Revelation chapter 6, verses 12 to 17. Let's use this chart to see the different emphasis then between Matthew 24 and Luke chapter 21. We have the wars, famines, earthquakes, etc., which is what is held in common by both of them. There's cosmic upheaval that's going to come later. See, all of these wars and famines and so on, that they are the beginning of birth pains, but the end is not yet. So what Jesus really is telling us here is that our focus needs to be his coming, not on these initial events that must take place, that they will be something that takes place. Matthew tells us after those things, there's an abomination of desolation that is connected to this. So the abomination of desolation, then these things are going to be taking place. So Matthew is referring to the Great Tribulation. We see that in verse 21. There will be great tribulation such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, and no, never will be. With Luke, he says, before these things. Then he speaks of the fall of Jerusalem. This is in 70 AD. This is that desolation. It's not an abomination of desolation. In Luke, the record is very clear, and Jesus is very careful not to use abomination of desolation in Luke 21, because it's a different historical account. Now, this is prophecy that Jesus is giving. That being the case, we need to see what prophecy is. Prophecy is telling history before it takes place. This is not a prediction. It's not as though Jesus is predicting and then it will happen. He already knows the history that is yet to take place, but he sees it as having taken place already. And so prophecy is just telling us history before it actually occurs. So he's doing that in both of these respects, but he's giving emphasis in Luke's account on the fall or the destruction of Jerusalem 40 years later from when we are right now with Jesus giving this teaching and instruction. So Matthew's account is desolation number 1. Or excuse me, Luke's account is desolation number 1, the one that will happen first, and then Matthew's is desolation number 2. Let's bring our attention back here, if we can, to the scriptures. Jesus says in all 3 accounts, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, he starts the same way. He says, let's have a look just so that we can see it together. Verse 4 of Matthew, see that no one leads you astray. He's telling us, don't be deceived. He does the same thing in Mark and the same thing in Luke. You can see that that's how he begins this instruction. Do not be led astray. See to it that no one leads you astray. And then there's 2 things that he emphasizes. Those that will be coming in his name, saying, I am the Christ, looking to lead you astray. And then he speaks about wars, rumors of wars, famines and earthquakes and the like. And he says, don't get caught up in those things. There will be those that throughout, from now until my coming, that they will emphasize these things to such a degree that that's all that people will be looking at and looking for. Jesus says, these things are going to happen. It needs to take place. This is the sequence of events, but the end is not yet. We see in verse 8, all these are but the beginning of the birth pains. So let's not, although we can see these things taking place today, we need to see that the end is not yet. The attention that we need to be giving is not exclusively to these things, but seeing them for what they are. They are signs, they're indicators that the end is upon us. But the end is not yet here. The end is not until the end has come, meaning that when Jesus comes to take us to be with himself, when he catches us away, the rapture, harpazo, the rapio of 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, of Matthew chapter 24, verse 36 and onwards, that we'll be caught up to be with him in the air at the coming, the presence of Jesus. His parousia is what it's referred to as in the Greek. But the word literally means his coming or his presence. But it takes in all of the last days, the day of the Lord, the rapture of the church, and his second coming. But specifically, the end is coming when we see that the church is caught away, and then there will be a short period of time before the tribulation begins. 7 years. And at the end of those 7 years, Jesus will return as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. So this, I've already given a spoiler away there. We're not going to have time to deal with it in this study. But we need to understand that this is what Jesus is referring to and drawing our attention to. So when we see that Jerusalem will be surrounded, that there will be a siege laid to it, would you look with me? Jesus already spoke about it not that long ago. Let's look at Luke chapter 19. So Luke chapter 19. When Jesus drew near, now this would have been on Sunday that Jesus made this announcement. When he drew near and saw the city, he wept over it, saying, would that you, even you, had known on this day the things that make for peace. But now they are hidden from your eyes. For the days will come upon you when your enemies will set up a barricade around you and surround you and hem you in on every side and tear you down to the ground, you and your children within you, and they will not leave one stone upon another in you, because you did not know the time of your visitation. This is what Jesus said 2 days ago, and now here we are in Luke 21. He's saying in verse 20, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, this is exactly what he said on Sunday, then know that its desolation has come near, its downfall, that it's going to be leveled. Let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Matthew speaks about a fleeing to the mountains, those who are in Judea, but it's a later date, so we'll look at that shortly. Right now, Jesus is talking about the surrounding of Jerusalem by the Roman armies who are going to lay siege to the city. When you see this taking place, get out of Jerusalem. Run to the mountains, and those who are inside the city, depart. And those who are in the country, don't enter into the city. These are days of vengeance to fulfill all that is written. So that is what I spoke of. Zechariah also speaks about it in chapter 14, the leveling of Jerusalem. But Zechariah is a yet future at Jesus' second coming. In this instance, here's what we see take place in history. The Roman general in AD 66 was Cestius Gallus, and he was coming to Jerusalem, going all throughout Israel, and putting out fires of revolt. See, the Jews, they were rebelling against Rome, and they were revolting in small pockets throughout Israel, through the Galilee and so on, throughout Judea, Samaria. And the time had come when this revolt was rising up from Jerusalem, and we have Cestius, who came to Jerusalem and was laying siege to Jerusalem. Well, when a siege is completed, you can't come in and you can't go out unless those that are laying siege to the city are willing to let people cross that boundary line to either go into the city or come out of the city. But this was an enemy, and he wasn't letting anybody out. The problem is that with this taking place, there were those that were captured, or that they were stuck inside the city, Christians included, so believers in Jesus. So when they had seen this taking place, perhaps they were a bit slow to make their move and get out of Jerusalem in time. But in the forbearance of God, Cestius, he ran out of supplies. He ran out of that which he needed for the front lines. So he had to call off the siege, and he went and regrouped. In the meantime, he was killed. And another took his place, Vespasian, who in a short time, in 69 AD, the winter, he would become the new emperor. There's a period of time now where the siege is lifted, and those that are in Jerusalem and are believers in Jesus and know the scriptures, they know that the siege has been brought upon Jerusalem. The revolts are increasing and intensifying. So they decide they're leaving. They're going to the mountains and the hills. They left Jerusalem. They went across the Jordan River, and they settled in a place called Pella. Meanwhile, Vespasian comes back to Jerusalem, and he starts to lay siege. He goes back to Rome to become emperor, and his son Titus is the new general, and he lays siege, a 5-month siege, to Jerusalem. And he doesn't let anybody out, but there are pilgrims that are coming to Jerusalem to worship at the Feast of Passover. What does Titus do? He allows them to cross the siege line to enter into the city, but he won't let anybody out. So now they're caught inside the city. And when all was said and done, Titus had built a siege wall around Jerusalem. There was no way of escape whatsoever. And eventually he conquered the city. Josephus says there was 1.1 million Jews that were killed and 100,000 that were taken as slaves, but not one of them were believers in Yeshua, because they had followed the word of Jesus, and they had gotten out of Jerusalem when they saw Jerusalem being surrounded by these foreign armies, and Jerusalem saw its desolation, even to the point that there was a fire in the temple. Some say that it was the rebels, the ones that were revolting, that they put the temple on fire. Others say that Titus and his men threw torches and flaming arrows into the temple precincts, and it caught on fire. Whichever way, the intensity of the heat melted all of the gold and the silver and the bronze, and it went between all of the cracks of the stonework. So what did Titus command the people to do? His soldiers, once they came in and they killed all that they killed and took captive those that he took captive, he ordered that every stone be taken apart, stone by stone by stone, in order to retrieve all of that precious metal, thereby fulfilling the words of Jesus that there will not be one stone left here upon another that will not be thrown down. See, this isn't just theoretical or an allegory. This is the Word of God, word by word, and to the very detail. How would it be? Why would they bother? Not one stone left upon another. Jesus knew that this would take place, and to the extent in which it would take place. Well, as we continue looking at Luke's account, we see that they will, verse 23, the women who are pregnant and those who are nursing infants in those days, alas, this is just speaking of, it's not going to be good. It won't be easy, because there's going to be great distress upon the earth and wrath against this people. Notice it doesn't say it's going to be the Great Tribulation, unlike anything before it, and nor will there be any days like it afterwards. This is speaking about a great distress that they will not want to endure. But it's not the Great Tribulation. They will fall by the edge of the sword and be led captive among all nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. So, the times of the Gentiles refers to the period of time in which there are no Davidic king on the throne. So no Jewish king on the throne of David. And we see that that's the case today. And this was the case since Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Jerusalem the first time back in 604. He came BC and he invaded Jerusalem. Then in 597, there was a second wave, and then 584, I think it was, that he destroyed the city and the temple, as it was a precursor of what would take place in 70 AD. And from that time on, there would be no Jewish king on the throne of David, and there still isn't today, and there won't be until Jesus comes to sit upon the throne of his father David at his second coming. There have been 4 Gentile kingdoms, so the times of the Gentiles. So Jesus says that they will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. You might say, well, Israel is a sovereign nation today, and that is true, but they still do not have sovereignty of the Temple Mount, and furthermore, they will be trampled under the feet of the Gentiles during the tribulation, when the world ruler, the Antichrist, sets up the abomination that causes desolation that Jesus speaks about in Matthew chapter 24. And at that time, Jesus tells them, get out of Jerusalem and pray that your flight is not in winter or on the Sabbath. It's very Jewish in content and context, that he's speaking to the Jewish nation in this respect. Well, let's look just for a moment at these nations. The times of the Gentiles. That Nebuchadnezzar, he had a dream of a statue with the head of gold and the shoulder and chest of silver, the belly and thighs of bronze, and the legs of iron, and then the feet with and toes of mixed with iron and clay. And they represented 4 kingdoms. But we see that there is a stone that comes, a rock that comes and strikes this statue, which represents world kingdoms. And it will destroy them, and then it becomes this massive mountain that fills the whole earth. And this represents the kingdom of our Lord and of his Christ. So we see that these kingdoms are represented then so Daniel 2 is the statue. Daniel chapters 7 and 8, we see that they are represented by these beasts, these animals. So Babylon, represented by gold, and also by the lion. So there, that is Babylon. Then we see Medo-Persia will be the next one, the chest of silver, and also symbolized as a bear. Greece is the belly and thigh of bronze, also represented by the winged leopard. Lastly, we see Rome, which is the legs of iron, and the beast that represents Rome is that 10-horned monster beast. It's some kind of a beast that doesn't fit descriptions of animals that exist today. And then the iron and the clay, the toes mixed with iron and clay, represents that rebirthed Roman Empire, which Revelation speaks about. And under that is the Antichrist and the dragon, Satan, that old serpent of old. That they will set up their rule during the tribulation. But Jesus will come to rule as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. We could get into a whole lot more detail regarding that, but our purpose here isn't to get into eschatology beyond what Jesus is speaking about. That's another study. But I do want to bring just a little more information and understanding regarding these things, so that it's not just words on a page for us, and that we can make sense of what Jesus is speaking about here. Let's have a look at Matthew's account, and in verse 15. Matthew 24 and verse 15. And we'll look at this aspect for just a few minutes as we wrap up our time together this evening, and then we'll continue on when we're together next. So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Would you come to Mark chapter 13? We haven't looked at this yet, but I want us to see it. So I mentioned that it's basically a carbon copy of everything Matthew is saying, Matthew's a carbon copy of everything Mark is saying, and Matthew adds more details. But I do want us to see this. In verse 14 of Mark's account, verse 14, but when you see the abomination of desolation. So both of them are speaking about an abomination of desolation, different than the desolation of the city of Jerusalem that Luke recorded. Standing where he ought not to be. Notice it says where he ought not to be. One little detail that's different there. The abomination in verse of Matthew just speaks about in the generic, standing in the holy place. That's referring to the world ruler. Now, church, we're not looking for the Antichrist. We're looking for the Christ. But we need to be aware of all these things, because it encourages us that the Word of God is true and it's accurate. And who knows, but there may be somebody down the road in the future that when we, the church, are with Christ in heaven, may view this and be instructed by the word of the Lord as to how you can put your faith in Jesus Christ and be saved, knowing that this word has spoken about 2,000 years ago, and even longer than that. But Jesus speaks about these things 2,000 years before it takes place, and you're living it right now. If you've noticed that the world has said the Christians are all gone, and we don't understand how or why, this is what's taking place. But please draw your attention to it where Jesus says, let the reader understand. Now, in both, it's in parentheses. And some have taken this to mean that both Matthew and Mark inserted this parenthetical statement just so that we would say, so that we would be instructed, understand. You need to have understanding of what Jesus is speaking about here. No, these are Jesus' words. Let the reader understand. Now, when he speaks this, he knows that what he's speaking is not written. What he's advising us, what he's instructing us with is this. Notice he draws our attention, spoken of by the prophet Daniel. And how do we know about what Daniel spoke of? It's written for us. And so Jesus says, I want you to read Daniel and understand what it is that you're reading. So Daniel spoke about this. Let the reader of Daniel understand the abomination that causes desolation. So with that detail in mind, we need to realize that Daniel speaks about this in Daniel chapters 9, 11, and 12, the abomination that causes desolation. We don't have time to get into it today, so we will pick it up from here next week, but you can look ahead in Daniel 9, verse 27, in chapter 11 and verse 31, and chapter 12 and verse 11. In all of those references, it speaks about the abomination that brings about desolation in the temple. And I encourage you to read the context, the verses surrounding it, so that when we come back together again next time, that you'll have an appreciation and a fuller understanding and preparation for what we will be looking at concerning the instruction Jesus is giving us for the end of the time before he returns to rule his second coming. As King of Kings and Lord of Lords, to establish the 1,000-year millennial reign. Praise his name. I'm excited about coming back and continuing to share this word and to continue walking with Jesus through the Gospels.